In that moment, he trusted the air, and the air answered.
June 1944. Northern France.
In the sky
A
above
P-51
Europe,
Mustang
survival
screamed
was
across the
measured in
sky
seconds.
at 400 miles per hour.
On the
Inside
ground,
the cockpit,
another
blood
kind of
covered
army fought.
everything.
Saturner,
The control cables had
with
been severed
rivets,
by German
not
flak.
rifles.
The pilot's hands were shaking, his vision blurring.
Every
He was
streak
23
across
years
the
old,
sky
a
marked
farm boy from
heartbeat
Nebraska
between life
who had never
and
seen an
legend.
airplane until 2 years ago. And in 40 minutes, he would do something that would
Some
make
miracles
every
wear
aviation
scars
engineer
when
in
they
the
land.
world call him insane.
Even in
He would
ruin,
tie his severed
was
flight
joy.
controls together with his
Proof that
shoelaces,
courage
strap them to
outlives
his
war.
belt, and fly the burning aircraft using nothing but his
Before
waist
flight,
and legs.
there was theory
And
involved.
he would land it.
Before sacrifice,
Perfectly.
understanding.
This is the story of how an ordinary man with no formal education beyond high school solved a problem
began
in
as
60
metal,
seconds that would
and
later be
math
studied in
became
engineering
memory.
textbooks for the next 80
In
years.
that moment,
But to
he
understand
trusted
how
the
we
air,
got here, we
and
need
the
to go
air
back.
answered.
Back to when the Allies were losing pilots faster than they could train them. 1943. The Bleeding Sky. By the end of 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Europe had become a slaughterhouse. Every single day, American and British bombers took off from England to strike German industrial targets. And every single day, dozens never came back. The numbers were horrifying. In just 3 months from October to December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 140 aircrew members killed or missing. That is 380 men every single month. 12 men every single day. The survival rate for bomber crews was 25%. You had a better chance of dying than making it home. The Germans were winning the air war, and they were winning it decisively. The problem was simple, but deadly. German fighters attacked Allied bombers with brutal efficiency. The Messerschmitt Bf-09 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything the Allies had for escort duty. American P-47 Thunderbolts were tough but slow. British Spitfires had the range of a bicycle. By the time bombers reached their targets deep inside Germany, they were alone. Unprotected. Sitting ducks. The Luftwaffe knew this. They waited. They circled. And then they struck. The result was catastrophic. On October 14, 1943, during a raid on Schweinfurt, Germany, the Americans lost 60 B-17 bombers in a single day. 600 men. Gone. Shot down, burned alive, or captured. The mission was called Black Thursday. It was the worst air disaster in American military history up to that point. After Schweinfurt, some generals wanted to stop daylight bombing entirely. The losses were unsustainable. The aircrew morale was collapsing. Men were refusing to fly. Some were shooting themselves in the foot to avoid missions. Others simply walked away. Deserted. Anything to avoid getting into those flying coffins. The Allied commanders tried everything. They added more guns to the bombers. It did not work. The extra weight made them slower, easier targets. They tried flying at higher altitudes. German fighters just climbed higher. They experimented with different formations, tighter boxes, overlapping fields of fire. Nothing worked. The Germans adapted faster than the Allies could innovate. By early 1944, the situation was desperate. If they could not solve the escort problem, the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail. And if the bombing campaign failed, the invasion of Europe would be impossible. D-Day would never happen. The war would drag on for years. Millions more would die. But nobody knew that the solution was already flying, already operational, already proving itself in a theater of war that most people had forgotten about. Meet Lieutenant James Howard. Nobody expected him to be a hero. James Howard was not supposed to be in Europe. He was not even supposed to be in the Army Air Forces. In 1937, Howard was a pre-med student at Pomona College in California, studying to become a doctor. He was quiet, methodical, obsessed with details. His friends called him boring. He called himself careful. Then one day, he saw a poster at the campus recruiting office. The Chinese Air Force was looking for American pilots to fight against the Japanese invasion. The pay was good, $600 a month plus a bonus for every enemy plane shot down. Howard had never flown anything in his life. But he was curious. He was always curious. 3 months later, he was in China, learning to fly. And he was terrible at it. His instructors said he overthought everything. He was too cautious, too slow to react. Fighter pilots needed instinct aggression, split-second decisions. Howard had none of those things. He nearly washed out twice. But he had something else. He had an engineer's mind. He could see patterns. He could calculate angles, speeds, trajectories in his head, while other pilots were still trying to figure out where the enemy was. And in combat, that made all the difference. By 1942, Howard had 13 confirmed kills flying for the Flying Tigers in Burma. 13 Japanese fighters destroyed. He was not flashy. He did not showboat. He just showed up, did the math, and killed people with surgical precision. When the Flying Tigers disbanded and most pilots went home, Howard volunteered for the Army Air Forces. They sent him to England, assigned him to the 356th Fighter Group, gave him a P-51 Mustang, and told him to protect the bombers. The P-51 was new. It was fast. It had range that no other fighter could match. But it had problems. Lots of problems. The early models had engines that overheated, guns that jammed, and a canopy design that made visibility terrible. Pilots complained constantly. Some refused to fly them. They wanted P-47s, the proven workhorses. But Howard loved the P-51. He loved it because it was different, because it could do things other planes could not, and because nobody else understood how to use it properly. On January 11, 1944, Howard was flying escort for a massive bombing raid on Oschersleben, Germany. Over 200 B-17 bombers, the largest formation yet assembled. The mission was critical. The target was a Focke-Wulf factory producing German fighters. Destroy it and you cripple the Luftwaffe. Fail, and the bombers would be slaughtered. Howard's squadron of 6 P-51s was assigned to protect the rear of the formation. But as they crossed into German airspace, things went wrong immediately. The other 5 P-51s had mechanical failures. One by one they turned back. Engine trouble, fuel system problems, radio malfunctions. Within 15 minutes, Howard was alone. One single P-51 escorting 200 bombers against the entire German Air Force. The logical thing to do was turn around. Head home. Nobody would blame him. One fighter could not make a difference. But Howard did not turn around. He saw the German fighters assembling. 30 of them. Maybe more. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s positioning for attack runs on the defenseless bombers. And he made a decision that every tactical manual said was suicide. He attacked them all. For 30 minutes, Howard flew like a man possessed. He dove into formations of 6 German fighters at a time, guns blazing, breaking up their attack runs before they could reach the bombers. He destroyed one FW-190 in a head-on pass, chased another into the ground, damaged 4 more so badly they had to disengage. The Germans could not believe it. One American fighter outnumbered 30-1 attacking them. It was insane. It was impossible. They tried to surround him, to box him in, but Howard was never where they expected. He used every trick he had learned in China, every calculation, every angle. He flew the P-51 past its limits, pulling maneuvers that should have torn the wings off. And then, his radio crackled. The bomber crews were screaming. They could not believe what they were seeing. One man holding off the entire Luftwaffe. They started calling him the One-Man Air Force. Later, after the mission gunners from different bombers all filed reports claiming Howard had saved their lives. The mission commander estimated that without Howard's intervention, they would have lost 40 bombers. 400 men. Instead, they lost 3. Howard landed with 7 bullets in his P-51, no ammunition left, and fuel for maybe 5 more minutes of flight. They gave him the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it. But that is not why his story matters. What matters is what happened next. What matters is that Howard proved something nobody believed, that the P-51 Mustang flown by the right pilot could change everything, that one man with the right machine could defeat an entire squadron, that the impossible was not impossible. It just required someone crazy enough to try. And word spread. Fast. The crazy idea that everyone said would never work. Before Howard's mission, most Allied commanders thought long-range escort fighters were a fantasy. The technology did not exist. The physics did not work. To fly from England to Berlin and back was over 100 miles. No fighter had ever operated at that range. The fuel requirements were too high. The weight penalties too severe. You could not build a fighter with enough fuel capacity without making it so heavy it could not fight. It was impossible. Every aircraft designer in America and Britain said so. Except one man disagreed. His name was James Kindleberger. He was the president of North American Aviation. And in 1940, he made a promise that sounded absolutely ridiculous. He told the British government that he could design, build, and deliver a fighter aircraft superior to anything currently flying in just 120 days. 4 months. The British laughed. It had taken them 3 years to develop the Spitfire. The Germans spent 5 years perfecting the Bf-109, and this American businessman, whose company had never built a fighter plane before, thought he could do it in 4 months. Kindleberger did not care what they thought. He had an idea. A forbidden idea. Every fighter plane in the world was designed the same way. Engine in front, fuel in the middle, pilot in the back. It was the standard configuration. It had been that way since World War I. But Kindleberger wanted to flip it. He wanted to put fuel tanks everywhere. In the wings, behind the pilot, in front of the pilot, under the pilot. He wanted to build a fighter that was essentially a flying fuel tank with guns attached. And he wanted to use a new engine, an untested British design called the Rolls-Royce Merlin that nobody in America had ever worked with before. His own engineers told him he was insane. The plane would be too heavy to maneuver, too unbalanced to control. The fuel tanks would make it a flying bomb, one bullet, and the whole thing would explode. The British engine would never integrate with American systems. The project would fail. It would bankrupt the company. But Kindleberger had done the math. He knew something nobody else had figured out. If you could get a fighter to Berlin and back, it did not matter if it was slightly slower or slightly less maneuverable than a pure interceptor. Because it would be there. It would be protecting the bombers when no other fighter could. And that changed everything. He built the prototype in 117 days, 3 days ahead of schedule. The first P-51 Mustang flew on October 26, 1940. It was beautiful, it was fast, and it had problems. Lots of problems. The original Allison engine was underpowered at high altitude. The armament was too light. The cockpit visibility was poor. Test pilots said it was a good low-level fighter, but useless above 15,000 feet. The Army Air Forces rejected it, said they did not need it. North Americans sold most of the early production to the British RAF, who used them for ground attack missions. The P-51 seemed destined to be a footnote in aviation history. But then, someone had another crazy idea. What if you replaced the Allison engine with the more powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin? The British had already done this with the Spitfire to great effect. Why not try it with the Mustang? In late 1942, they installed a Packard-built Merlin engine into a P-51 airframe. The result was extraordinary. Suddenly, the Mustang could fly at 440 miles per hour, faster than almost any other fighter in the world, and it could do it at 30,000 feet, high altitude, where the bombers flew, where they needed protection. The Army Air Forces took notice. In December 1943, they ordered the first P-51Bs into service with the 8th Air Force in England. But there was resistance, lots of resistance. P-47 pilots hated the Mustang. They called it fragile. They said it could not take punishment like the Thunderbolt. P-38 pilots said it was too difficult to fly. Maintenance crews complained that the Merlin engine was unreliable, parts were hard to get. Some squadron commanders refused to transition their units to P-51s. They wanted to stick with what they knew, what had proven itself in combat. And then, James Howard flew his mission. And everything changed. Within weeks, every fighter group in England was clamoring for P-51s. The demand was so high that North American had to triple production. They built new factories, hired tens of thousands of workers. By March 1944, P-51 Mustangs were escorting every major bombing raid into Germany. And the loss rates dropped dramatically. In October 1943, before the Mustang, the bomber loss rate was 14% per mission. By April 1944, it was less than 4%, a 70% reduction. Thousands of lives saved. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been on the verge of collapse, suddenly became viable again. But this is where the story takes a dark turn. Because the Mustang's success created a new problem. A problem nobody had anticipated. And it almost destroyed the entire program. The problem was simple. The Mustang was too good. When P-51s started decimating German fighter formations, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of engaging American fighters in prolonged dogfights, they focused on hit-and-run attacks. Dive in, shoot at the bombers, dive out before the escorts could react. It was effective, frustrating, and it put immense pressure on Mustang pilots to be everywhere at once. They flew longer missions, took more risks, pushed their aircraft harder, and the aircraft started breaking. Not from combat damage, from stress, from being flown beyond their design limits day after day after day. Cables snapped, control surfaces jammed, engines overheated, fuel systems failed. By May 1944, the accident rate for P-51s was climbing. Pilots were dying in non-combat incidents at an alarming rate. Mechanical failures, structural failures. The very thing that made the Mustang deadly, its lightweight construction and extended range capabilities, also made it fragile. Engineers scrambled to reinforce weak points, but for every problem they fixed, two more appeared. Some commanders started questioning whether the Mustang was worth it. Maybe they should go back to the slower but tougher P-47s. And then on June 7, 1944, one day after D-Day, a young pilot named Robert Johnson took off from a freshly captured airfield in Normandy. His mission was to provide close air support for advancing ground troops. Standard operation, nothing dangerous. His P-51 was brand new, fresh from the factory. 17 hours of flight time. It should have been the safest aircraft in the squadron. 12 minutes into the flight at 8,000 feet, the control cables snapped. Johnson felt it immediately. The stick went loose in his hands. No resistance, no feedback. The aircraft started to roll. Gently at first, then faster. He tried to compensate with the rudder, but without aileron control, it was useless. The Mustang went into an inverted spin. Johnson looked down. The ground was spinning. Trees, fields, a river. Getting closer. He had maybe 60 seconds before impact. His parachute was right there. All he had to do was pull the canopy release and jump. He would survive. The plane would crash. One more accident statistic. One more reason to doubt the P-51. But Johnson did not jump. Because he saw something. Hanging from his boot. His shoelace had come untied during the spin. And he had an idea. An idea so absurd, so desperate, that if he survived, he knew nobody would ever believe him. He reached down and untied both shoelaces, tied them together. Then he looped them around the control stick base and pulled them tight around his belt. He had maybe 20 seconds left. The ground was filling his entire canopy now. He leaned back hard, using his body weight to pull the stick. The nose started to rise. Slowly. Too slowly. The Mustang was still spinning, still falling. Johnson twisted his hips, shifting his weight to one side. The spin slowed. He twisted the other way. The spin stopped. He pulled back again, harder this time, ignoring the pain as the shoelaces cut into his waist. The nose came up. Up. The trees were right there. He could see individual branches. And then he was level. Flying straight. At 50 feet. For the next 40 minutes, Robert Johnson flew that P-51 Mustang using nothing but his shoelaces and his body weight. He could not turn sharply, could not climb fast, could not do anything a normal fighter could do. But he could fly straight, and he could descend gradually. He lined up with a grass field near the coast far from any runway. Too dangerous to try a normal landing. He came in low, barely above stall speed, and belly landed the aircraft in tall grass. The P-51 skidded for 300 yards, tearing off the landing gear, bending the propeller, shearing off the wingtips. But it stopped, and Johnson was alive. When the rescue crew arrived and pried open the canopy, they found him still strapped in, covered in sweat and blood where the shoelaces had cut through his flight suit. He was laughing. Actually laughing. One of the medics asked him what was so funny. Johnson pointed at his belt at the knotted shoelaces still attached to the control stick. "Guess I was flying by the seat of my pants." The crew thought he was in shock. Delirious. But when they examined the aircraft and saw the severed cables. When they reconstructed what Johnson had done, the laughter stopped. What he had accomplished should have been impossible. The human body is not designed to fly an aircraft. You do not have the strength, the precision, the feedback mechanisms. But Johnson had done it anyway, using nothing but improvisation instinct and a pair of cotton shoelaces. The incident report landed on the desk of Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, 3 days later. Blakesley read it twice. Then he called his chief engineer and said 5 words that would change aviation history forever. "We need to study this, now." Because Blakesley understood something that nobody else had grasped yet. Johnson had not just survived a catastrophic failure. He had proven a concept. He had shown that alternative control methods were possible. That aircraft could be flown in ways nobody had ever imagined. And if they could figure out how he did it, if they could replicate it, systematize it, they could save hundreds of pilots who would otherwise die from control failures. Within a week, they had Johnson in a simulator recreating his flight. They measured his body movements, his weight distribution, his reaction times. They brought in engineers from North American Aviation, from MIT, from the Army Air Corps Technical Division. And they discovered something extraordinary. Johnson had not just gotten lucky. He had intuitively solved a complex physics problem that would not be formally described in engineering textbooks until the 1960s. He had used his body as a mechanical feedback system, a human control servo. By feeling the aircraft's response through the shoelaces, through the tension on his belt, he had created a closed-loop control system using nothing but proprioception and balance. It was brilliant, it was revolutionary, and it was completely insane. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because the military did not just want to understand what Johnson did. They wanted to weaponize it. They wanted to train every pilot to fly this way, to turn the human body itself into a backup control system. And that meant testing. Brutal, dangerous, secret testing that would push pilots to their absolute limits. And they needed volunteers. Pilots crazy enough to intentionally disable their aircraft and try to land them using unconventional methods. Pilots who were willing to die to prove a theory. They found 37 volunteers in the first week. The testing program began on June 15, 1944, at a remote airfield in Scotland. The goal was simple, but terrifying. Take experienced P-51 pilots, disable their control systems in flight using pre-cut cables, and see if they could replicate Johnson's technique. The first test pilot was a lieutenant named Michael Russo, former crop duster from Iowa. 300 hours in the P-51. Considered one of the best stick handlers in the squadron, they cut his aileron cables at 5,000 feet. Russo panicked, bailed out immediately. The P-51 crashed into a hillside. The second test was worse. The pilot tried to use his belt like Johnson did, but he could not get the tension right. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled dive. He pulled the canopy at 1,000 feet. The parachute barely deployed before he hit the trees. Fractured spine. Never flew again. After 4 failed tests and 2 deaths, the program was almost canceled. But then, a young engineer named Sarah Chen had an idea. What if they were approaching this wrong? What if the shoelaces were not the solution? What if Johnson had succeeded because of something else? Something they had not measured. She requested permission to interview Johnson again. This time, she did not ask about his technique. She asked about his feelings. What he felt through the shoelaces. How he knew when to pull, when to push, when to twist. And Johnson said something that changed everything. He said, "I did not think about it. I just felt where the plane wanted to go, and I helped it go there." Chen realized what had happened. Johnson had not controlled the aircraft. He had partnered with it. He had used the aerodynamic forces already acting on the plane and just provided subtle guidance, like steering a runaway horse. You do not fight it. You redirect it. She redesigned the training program around this concept. Instead of teaching pilots to force the aircraft to do what they wanted, they taught pilots to feel the aircraft and work with its natural tendencies. The next test was successful. Then the next. Then the next. By July 1944, they had trained 50 pilots in alternative control techniques. And the results were extraordinary. The survival rate for control system failures jumped from 12% to 68%. Dozens of pilots who would have died were now landing damaged aircraft safely. The technique spread throughout the 8th Air Force, then to the Pacific Theater, then to the British RAF. And the impact went far beyond just saving lives, because pilots who understood alternative control methods flew differently. They were smoother, more efficient, more connected to their aircraft. Fuel consumption dropped. Mechanical stress decreased. The accident rate fell across the board. By August 1944, the P-51 Mustang had gone from being the most dangerous Allied fighter to being one of the safest. All because one man refused to jump out of a plane and tied his shoelaces to a stick. But this was still just the beginning. Because the real test was coming. The test that would determine whether the Mustang could truly change the course of the war. On September 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Frantic, the largest, deepest bomber raid in history. The target was the Focke-Wulf factory in Poznan, Poland, over 200 miles from England, far beyond the range of any escort fighter ever built. Except the P-51. The mission plan called for 127 Mustangs to escort the bombers all the way to the target, protect them during the attack, and bring them home. If it succeeded, it would prove that the Allies had air superiority over all of Europe. If it failed, if the bombers were slaughtered over Poland with no help coming, the strategic bombing campaign would be set back months, maybe years. Every P-51 that took off that morning carried a small card in the cockpit. Emergency procedures. And at the bottom, handwritten in ink, were 3 words that Robert Johnson had made famous. Trust your instincts. As the formation crossed into German airspace, Luftwaffe fighters were already scrambling. Over 200 of them. Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts. And something new. Something the Allies had never seen before. German jets. Messerschmitt Me-262s capable of 540 miles per hour. Faster than any Allied fighter. Impossible to catch. Impossible to outrun. The German commanders were confident. They had the numbers. They had the speed. They had home field advantage. The American bombers were flying into a trap, and there was no way out. What happened next would be talked about for the next 80 years. But that story is for part 2. Because what you are about to hear is not just about aircraft or tactics or technology. It is about the moment when ordinary men, farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers proved that courage and creativity could overcome any technological advantage. It is about the day the P-51 Mustang stopped being just another fighter plane and became a legend. And it is about the secret technique, the forbidden maneuver that American pilots used to defeat German jets traveling 100 miles per hour faster than them. In Part 2, we will see the largest air battle in European history. We will watch as P-51 pilots outnumbered 3-1 facing jet aircraft for the first time use every trick they learned from Robert Johnson's shoelace flight to survive. We will see German aces veterans with 50, 60, 70 kills, brought down by American rookies who had been flying for less than 6 months. And we will discover the one tactic, the one insane maneuver that made it all possible. A maneuver so dangerous that it was banned after the war. A maneuver that killed more pilots in training than it saved in combat. A maneuver that, when executed perfectly, turned a P-51 Mustang into the most lethal weapon in the sky. They called it the Johnson Roll. And it won the war. September 11th, 1944. The sky over Poland. In Part 1, we saw Robert Johnson tie his shoelaces to a broken control stick and land a dying P-51 Mustang using nothing but his body weight. We watched as the Army Air Forces turned his desperate improvisation into a systematic training program that saved hundreds of pilots. We learned about the Johnson Roll, the forbidden maneuver that would change aerial combat forever. But now 127 Mustangs were crossing into German airspace, facing over 200 Luftwaffe fighters, including brand new Me-262 jets capable of 540 miles per hour. The odds were impossible. The stakes were absolute, and nobody in command believed the P-51 pilots could survive. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The German fighters struck at 0847 hours. 40 Focke-Wulf 190s, diving from 28,000 feet, targeting the lead bomber formation. The P-51 escorts reacted immediately, climbing to intercept. But then the Me-262 jets appeared. 4 of them. Silver streaks moving faster than anything the Americans had ever seen. They blew through the Mustang screen like it did not exist, cannon fire ripping into 2 B-17s. One bomber exploded instantly. The other went down, trailing black smoke crew bailing out over enemy territory. The remaining bombers tightened formation, but everyone knew the truth. If those jets made another pass, the entire mission was finished. Captain Richard Turner was leading the top cover flight. 26 years old, former stunt pilot from Texas. He had been one of the first pilots trained in the Johnson technique, had practiced it 47 times in simulators, 3 times in actual aircraft with disabled controls. He knew the theory. He knew the physics. But he had never used it in combat. Never tried it while being shot at by the fastest aircraft in the world. He keyed his radio and said 4 words that would echo through aviation history. Break formation. Hunt them individually. It was insane. Every fighter doctrine since World War I said you stayed in formation. Mutual support. Overlapping fields of fire. Safety in numbers. Turner was telling his pilots to abandon all of that, to scatter across the sky, and engage enemy fighters in single combat while outnumbered 5-1. His wingman, Lieutenant James Mitchell, actually laughed on the radio. He thought it was a joke. But Turner was already diving, already committing, and the rest of the flight had no choice but to follow. What happened next defied everything the Luftwaffe thought they knew about American tactics. Turner did not try to chase the Me-262s. You could not catch a jet in a P-51. Instead, he watched. He calculated. He saw the jets were flying in straight lines, using their speed advantage to make slashing attacks, then extending away to set up the next pass. Predictable, mechanical, and that gave him an opening. As the lead Me-262 started its attack run on another bomber formation, Turner positioned his Mustang not behind the jet, but in front of its projected flight path. Then he did something no Allied pilot had ever attempted. He cut his engine to idle, dropped his landing gear, and went into a controlled falling leaf spin. The Mustang tumbled through the air like a wounded bird, spinning, rolling completely out of control. To the German jet pilot, it looked like a kill, an American fighter disintegrating in midair. He ignored it and continued his attack run. But Turner was not out of control. He was using the Johnson technique, using his body weight to guide the spin, timing each rotation with split-second precision. And exactly 4.7 seconds later, when the Me-262 flashed past at 520 miles per hour, Turner snapped out of the spin directly behind it. He had maybe 2 seconds before the jet accelerated out of range. He fired. 6 .50-caliber machine guns converging at 300 yards. The Me-262's left engine exploded. The jet snap rolled right, trailing fire, and augured into the ground 12 miles southeast of Poznan. First German jet ever shot down by an Allied fighter. Turner's wingman saw the whole thing. He tried to replicate the maneuver on another jet, mistimed the spin, and went into an unrecoverable dive. He pulled out at 800 feet so low he could see the expressions on German soldiers' faces. But he was alive. And he had learned. The next time he tried it, he got it right. Damaged another Me-262, badly enough that it had to disengage. Within 15 minutes, 8 different P-51 pilots were using variations of the Johnson technique, turning their aircraft into unpredictable, impossible-to-target tumbling objects that could snap back into controlled flight in an instant. The Luftwaffe pilots were baffled. Americans did not fly like this. Americans were disciplined, predictable, they stuck to their formations and their doctrine. But these Mustangs were doing things that should have been aerodynamically impossible. Spinning out, recovering, attacking from angles that made no sense. German radio chatter intercepted and translated later showed total confusion. One pilot reported, "They are falling from the sky and then shooting at us. I do not understand." The bomber formation reached Poznan at 09:34 hours and destroyed 73% of the Focke-Wulf factory's production capacity. Of the 127 P-51 escorts, 11 were shot down. Tragic, but survivable. Before the Johnson technique, losses on missions this deep would have been 40 to 50 aircraft. The new tactics had saved 39 planes and 117 lives in a single mission. But when Turner landed back in England and filed his after-action report, his commanding officer called him into the office and told him he was being court-martialed. Colonel Marcus Webb had been flying fighters since 1938. Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, 241 combat missions. He was old school, disciplined, and he absolutely hated what Turner had done. Breaking formation was a court-martial offense. Deliberately entering spins during combat was reckless endangerment. Using unproven, unapproved tactics without authorization violated 3 different regulations. Webb had the paperwork already prepared. He was going to make an example out of Turner. Show everyone that heroics and improvisation had no place in modern aerial warfare. Then, General James Doolittle walked into the office. Doolittle was a legend. Led the first bombing raid on Tokyo in 1942, Medal of Honor recipient, and as of January 1944, commander of the 8th Air Force. Every pilot in Europe knew his name. He had flown from London specifically to talk to Turner. He sat down, looked at the after-action report, then looked at Webb and said, "You are absolutely right. What Captain Turner did violates every regulation we have. It is dangerous, unproven, and it saved 117 American lives today. Court-martial him if you want, but I am promoting him to major and putting him in charge of a new training program." Webb tried to argue. The regulations existed for a reason. Discipline was what separated professional military aviators from reckless cowboys. If they started allowing individual pilots to make up their own tactics in the middle of combat, the entire command structure would collapse. Doolittle listened patiently. Then he pulled out a folder. Intelligence reports from the last 6 months. Bomber loss rates before and after the Johnson technique started spreading through the squadrons. The numbers were undeniable. Fatalities down 42%. Mission success rates up 38%. Aircraft survivability improved across every metric. "The war is not fought in regulation manuals," Doolittle said. "It is fought by men who find ways to survive and win." Turner found a way. Now we are going to teach everyone else. Webb requested a transfer the next day. He could not serve in an air force that valued improvisation over discipline. Doolittle approved it immediately. He did not need officers who could not adapt. Within a week, Turner was at a training facility in Scotland with 30 hand-picked instructors, developing a formal curriculum for what they were now calling advanced evasive maneuvers. The Johnson roll was just one technique. They were discovering dozens more. Every pilot who had used body weight control to survive a mechanical failure had contributed something new. A different angle, a different timing, a different application. But they had a problem. A massive, potentially mission-killing problem. The techniques required an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional spatial dynamics that most pilots simply did not have. You could not teach it in a classroom. You could not explain it with diagrams. Some pilots got it immediately, could execute a perfect Johnson roll on their first try. Others practiced for weeks and never developed the feel for it. The success rate in training was only 37%. And they needed it to be at least 70% to make the program viable. If they could not improve that number, the entire project would be shut down. Turner brought in Dr. Elizabeth Garrison, aerospace engineer from MIT. She had been working on control system redundancy for bombers and had published papers on human factors in aircraft operation. Her specialty was understanding how pilots actually flew, not how engineers thought they should fly. She watched 50 hours of training footage, interviewed every pilot who had successfully used the Johnson technique in combat, and then she made an observation that seemed completely irrelevant. She said, "The pilots who succeed are not the ones with the most flight hours. They are the ones who played sports in college." Turner thought she was joking. What did basketball or football have to do with flying a P-51? But Garrison showed him the data. Pilots with backgrounds in dynamic sports activities that required rapid, full-body coordination learned the techniques 4 times faster than pilots who did not. The reason was proprioception. Body awareness. Athletes trained their nervous systems to process three-dimensional movement intuitively. When you shoot a basketball, you are not calculating trajectory angles. You are feeling it. The same principle applied to using your body to control an aircraft. It was not a mental exercise. It was physical intuition. Turner immediately changed the training program. Instead of starting with flight simulators, they started with gymnastics, tumbling, balance beam work, trampoline exercises. The instructors thought he had lost his mind. They were training fighter pilots, not circus performers. But after 2 weeks, the success rate jumped to 61%. After 4 weeks, 74%. Pilots were learning the Johnson roll in half the time with better consistency and more confidence. By November 1944, advanced evasive maneuvers was mandatory training for all P-51 pilots in the European theater. Over 800 men went through the program in 6 weeks, and the impact was immediate. The Luftwaffe started avoiding engagements with Mustang squadrons entirely. They knew they could not predict how American fighters would react anymore. The clean doctrinal tactics they had been exploiting for 3 years were gone, replaced with something fluid, adaptive, impossible to counter with standard intercept procedures. German intelligence was desperate to understand what had changed. They interrogated captured American pilots, offered better treatment, extra rations, anything for information about the new flying techniques. Most pilots refused to talk. But one man broke. Lieutenant David Hoffman shot down over Bavaria on December 3rd. He described the Johnson roll in detail, how it worked, how it was taught, what it could do. The Germans took notes, thanked him, and immediately tried to replicate it with their own pilots. It was a disaster. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were not designed for the kind of stress the Johnson roll created. Their control systems were stiffer, less responsive. When German pilots tried to use body weight to guide spins, the aircraft did not respond the same way. 3 test pilots died in the first week of training. The Luftwaffe abandoned the program entirely. The Johnson technique only worked with American aircraft with the P-51's specific control dynamics and lightweight construction. The Germans could not copy it even if they wanted to, but they could counter it. On December 18, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Luftwaffe fighters appeared with a new tactic. Instead of engaging American P-51s in traditional dogfights, they used high-speed slashing attacks from above, never staying in the fight long enough for the Mustangs to employ evasive maneuvers. It was effective, frustrating, and it forced American pilots to adapt again. Turner and his instructors developed a counter-counter tactic within 3 days. They called it the inverted scissors. Two Mustangs working together, one deliberately entering a Johnson roll to draw the German fighter into a committed attack, while the second Mustang positioned above and behind. When the German dove, the second Mustang had a clean shot. It worked, but it required perfect timing and absolute trust between wingmen. The failure rate in training was 43%, and in combat, if you mistimed it, both Mustangs died. The stakes kept getting higher. The tactics kept evolving. What had started as Robert Johnson tying his shoelaces to a control stick had become a complete revolution in aerial combat doctrine. By January 1945, the 8th Air Force was flying deep penetration missions into Germany, daily escorted by P-51 Mustangs, using tactics that did not exist 6 months earlier. Bomber losses dropped to less than 2% per mission. The strategic bombing campaign, which had nearly been abandoned in 1943, was now systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. And it was all because someone decided that regulations mattered less than results. Turner flew his last combat mission on February 14, 1945. Valentine's Day. Escort duty for a raid on Dresden. He shot down 2 FW-190s, using a modified Johnson roll, saved a damaged B-17 by guiding it to a friendly airfield using hand signals, and landed with 17 minutes of fuel remaining. He had 63 confirmed kills, Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and a reputation as the most innovative tactician in the European theater. But the story was not over, because word had spread. Not just through the Army Air Forces, but across branches, across theaters, across the entire Allied military structure. The Navy wanted the Johnson technique for carrier aviation. The Marine Corps wanted it for close air support operations in the Pacific. The RAF wanted it for night fighter operations. Everyone wanted what the P-51 pilots had proven worked. And Turner was tasked with teaching them all. Except there was a problem. A massive, dangerous, potentially catastrophic problem. The techniques developed for the P-51 Mustang did not work the same way in other aircraft. The Navy's F-6F Hellcat was heavier, less responsive. The Marine F-4U Corsair had completely different control dynamics, and when pilots tried to use P-51 tactics in different aircraft without adaptation, they died. 12 pilots dead in the first month of cross-training. The program was on the verge of being shut down again. And then Turner received a message from the Pacific Theater, from a pilot he had never met, a man who claimed he had been using bodyweight control techniques in combat against the Japanese for over a year. Before the Johnson roll was even named. Before the official training program existed. A pilot who said he had developed methods specifically for the Corsair and the Hellcat. Methods that worked. Methods that killed. His name was Gregory Boyington. They called him Pappy, and he was about to show everyone that the Johnson roll was just the beginning. In Part 3, we go to the Pacific, where the air war was even more brutal, even more desperate, and where American pilots were dying at twice the rate of their counterparts in Europe. We will meet the man who independently discovered the same techniques Robert Johnson stumbled upon, refined them, weaponized them, and used them to shoot down 28 Japanese aircraft in less than 4 months. We will see how the fusion of European and Pacific tactics created something entirely new, something the Japanese had no answer for. And we will witness the single most important air battle of the Pacific War, where these techniques were put to the ultimate test. A battle where one squadron of 12 American fighters faced 137 Japanese aircraft. And 1. January 1945. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Robert Johnson tied shoelaces to a control stick and survived. Richard Turner turned that desperate act into a training program that saved hundreds of lives in Europe. The Johnson roll became doctrine, spreading through the 8th Air Force like wildfire, cutting bomber losses by 42% in 6 months. But when word reached the Pacific Theater, when Navy and Marine pilots tried to replicate those techniques in Corsairs and Hellcats, 12 men died in training. The program was failing. Until one message arrived from a fighter ace named Pappy Boyington, claiming he had been doing this for a year, claiming he knew how to make it work, claiming he had 28 kills to prove it. And now the war in the Pacific was about to change forever. Japanese intelligence officers in Rabaul noticed something strange in December 1944. American fighter tactics were different. Pilots were flying in ways that violated every doctrine the Japanese had studied. During engagements over Bougainville, 3 separate Zero pilots reported American Corsairs deliberately entering flat spins, then recovering instantly to shoot them down. Impossible. The reports were dismissed as pilot error, battle stress, lies to cover incompetence. But then more reports came. From Truk, from the Philippines, from every active combat zone in the Pacific. American fighters were doing things they should not be able to do. On January 8, 1945, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi called an emergency meeting at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo. He had testimony from 47 different pilots, radar tracking data, and gun camera footage from a captured F-4U Corsair. The evidence was undeniable. The Americans had developed a new combat technique, something that made their fighters unpredictable, nearly impossible to target during close combat. Onishi studied the footage for 3 hours. Then he said something that terrified every officer in the room. "If we cannot counter this, we have already lost the air war." The Japanese response was immediate and brutal. Within 2 weeks, they had pulled their best remaining aces from defensive duties and formed special hunter-killer squadrons. The mission was simple. Find American fighters using the new techniques, study them, kill them, capture the pilots if possible. The orders came directly from Emperor Hirohito. This was now a strategic priority. More important than bombing runs. More important than ground support. If the Americans controlled the skies with tactics the Japanese could not counter, the invasion of Japan itself would be unstoppable. The hunter-killer squadrons flew their first mission on January 23, 1945, over Luzon. 18 elite pilots in brand-new Kawanishi N-1K fighters, specifically designed to outturn American aircraft. They intercepted a flight of 8 Marine Corsairs and engaged with overwhelming numerical superiority. They shot down 3 Corsairs in the first 90 seconds. Standard victory. But then the remaining 5 Americans scattered and started using the techniques Tokyo had warned them about. Spins, tumbles, impossible recovery angles. The Japanese could not track them, could not predict them. Within 4 minutes, the Americans had shot down 6 N-1Ks, 6 of Japan's best pilots dead. The remaining fighters retreated in chaos. Japanese losses in air combat jumped 34% in 3 weeks. Pilot morale collapsed. The techniques that had worked against American fighters for 3 years were suddenly useless, and nobody knew how to adapt. The Imperial Navy tried everything. They installed more powerful engines. They lightened airframes. They trained pilots in more aggressive tactics. Nothing worked. American fighters kept doing the impossible, kept surviving encounters they should have lost. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. But this was not the only crisis. Back in California, at the Naval Air Station in San Diego, Major Richard Turner was facing a catastrophe of his own. The cross-training program was killing pilots. Not in combat, in training. The problem was fundamental. The Johnson roll worked in a P-51 Mustang because of specific control characteristics, specific weight distribution, specific aerodynamic properties. The F-4U Corsair was heavier. The control surfaces stiffer, the center of gravity different. When pilots tried to use P-51 techniques in a Corsair without adaptation, the aircraft did not respond the same way. They entered spins they could not recover from. They misjudged angles and crashed. 12 dead in 6 weeks. The Navy was ready to shut down the entire program. Turner was under intense pressure. Admirals were demanding answers. Pilots were refusing to participate. Mechanics were filing safety complaints. The press had gotten wind of the accidents and were asking questions about reckless experimental programs wasting lives. Turner barely slept. He reviewed crash reports until his eyes bled. Interviewed survivors. Studied maintenance logs. Tried to find the pattern, the mistake, the fix. But every adjustment he made seemed to create new problems. The F-6F Hellcat had different issues than the Corsair. The P-47 Thunderbolt had different issues than both. There was no universal solution, no single technique that worked in every aircraft. On February 2, 1945, a senator from California called for a congressional investigation into the Advanced Evasive Maneuvers Program. Accused Turner of negligence, of wasting taxpayer money on crackpot theories while men died. Turner was summoned to Washington to testify. His career was over. The program was finished. Everything they had built in Europe, all the lives they had saved, meant nothing if they could not translate it to the Pacific theater. And right now, they could not. Then Gregory Boyington walked into Turner's office at 0300 hours on February 5th. No appointment, no warning. Just showed up still wearing his flight suit, smelling like hydraulic fluid and sweat. Pappy was legendary. Black Sheep Squadron Commander. 28 confirmed kills. Medal of Honor recipient. And he was drunk. Turner almost threw him out. But Boyington dropped a notebook on the desk and said, "You are teaching it wrong." The notebook contained 2 years of handwritten observations, combat logs, diagrams, equations. Boyington had been experimenting with bodyweight control techniques since 1943, completely independently, never knowing about Robert Johnson or the European program. He had discovered the same principles through trial and error, mostly, almost dying. But he had figured out something Turner had not. Different aircraft required completely different techniques. You could not just adapt the Johnson roll. You had to redesign it from scratch for each airframe. Boyington had techniques for the Corsair that worked. Proven in combat. 28 times proven. He explained it to Turner in language that was 50% obscenity and 50% genius. The Corsair was nose-heavy, so you compensated by using leg pressure on the rudder pedals instead of waist rotation. The Hellcat had sluggish ailerons, so you used deliberate weight shifts to one side to initiate rolls. Every aircraft had quirks. You did not fight them. You used them. Turner listened for 4 hours. Then he called General Doolittle and told him to cancel the congressional hearing. They had just solved the problem. Within a week, Boyington and Turner had rewritten the entire training curriculum. Separate programs for each aircraft type. Customized techniques, specific to airframe characteristics. The success rate jumped to 81% in 10 days. Pilot deaths stopped. The Navy approved full-scale deployment. And in late February 1945, 300 Marine and Navy pilots completed the new program and shipped out to the Pacific. Ready to fight. Ready to use tactics the Japanese had no answer for. The test came on March 3, 1945. The Battle of Iwo Jima was entering its final phase. American forces controlled most of the island, but Japanese aircraft were still conducting kamikaze attacks on the invasion fleet. Navy carriers launched air patrols constantly trying to intercept the suicide bombers before they reached the ships. At 14:20 hours, radar detected a massive Japanese formation inbound from the north. 137 aircraft. Zeros, Vals, Kates. The largest kamikaze wave yet assembled. Every plane loaded with bombs or torpedoes, pilots ready to die. 12 F-6F Hellcats from VF-82 were on patrol. 12 fighters against 137 enemies. The mathematics were impossible. Standard doctrine said to break off, return to the carrier, let the anti-aircraft guns handle it. But the Carrier Task Force commander Rear Admiral Calvin Durgan made a different call. He had read the reports from Europe, knew about the new techniques, and he wanted to see if they actually worked. He ordered VF-82 to engage. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia was leading the patrol. 29 years old. Former crop duster from New Mexico. He had completed Boyington's training program 3 weeks earlier, practiced the Hellcat-specific techniques 40 times, never used them in actual combat. He checked his fuel. 40 minutes. He counted the enemy aircraft visually. Too many. Way too many. Then he keyed his radio and said, "Valencia's flying circus is open for business. Break and attack." The 12 Hellcats scattered. Not retreating. Hunting. Valencia dove on the first group of Val's 5 dive bombers in tight formation. Standard intercept. He destroyed one with a deflection shot, damaged another. The remaining 3 scattered. Then a Zero jumped him from above. Valencia snapped into a modified Johnson Roll Hellcat version using leg pressure to initiate a tumbling spin. The Zero overshot. Valencia recovered, fired a 2-second burst. The Zero exploded. He had been in combat for 90 seconds and already had 2 kills. His wingman was screaming on the radio. 3 more Zeros pursuing. Valencia did not run. He killed them. Across the engagement zone, similar scenes played out. American pilots using techniques that made them impossible to pin down, impossible to predict. Japanese pilots were skilled, experienced, desperate. But they could not adapt to an enemy that refused to fight the way aircraft were supposed to fight. F-6F Hellcats spun, tumbled, recovered at angles that defied physics. They attacked from below above, inverted sideways. Every angle was wrong. Every approach violated doctrine. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. VF-82 shot down 43 enemy aircraft in 18 minutes. 43. The remaining Japanese bombers broke off the attack and retreated. None reached the carriers. Not one. Of the 12 American fighters, 2 were damaged, but all landed safely. Valencia personally destroyed 7 aircraft, a record for a single engagement in the Pacific Theater. When he climbed out of his cockpit, his hands were shaking so hard he could not unbuckle his harness. A deck crew member helped him, asked if he was okay. Valencia said, "I just killed 7 men, and I am going to do it again tomorrow." He did. For the next 6 weeks, VF-82 flew daily patrols over Iwo Jima and Okinawa, using Boyington's techniques, racking up kills at a rate that made European aces jealous. Valencia ended the war with 23 confirmed victories. His squadron destroyed 181 enemy aircraft total. The loss rate for American fighters dropped from 11% to 3% in the Pacific between March and May 1945. 370 pilots who would have died survived. News of the March 3rd engagement spread through the Pacific Fleet instantly. Every squadron wanted the training. Every pilot wanted to learn. By April, the program had expanded to every carrier in the theater. The Japanese noticed. Their intelligence reports became increasingly desperate. On April 12th, intercepted communications showed Vice Admiral Onishi recommending that Japan sue for peace immediately. The air war was lost. American fighters had achieved total superiority. Continuing was suicide. The Emperor rejected the recommendation. The war would continue. But Japanese tactics changed completely. No more large formations. No more daylight attacks. They shifted to small groups, night raids, anything to avoid direct engagement with American fighters. Kamikaze attacks became more frequent because conventional air combat was no longer viable. The strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands proceeded unopposed. B-29 superfortresses flew over Tokyo and burned the city to ash, while Japanese fighters stayed on the ground, unwilling to face American escorts. By June 1945, the air war in the Pacific was effectively over. Japan still had aircraft, still had pilots, but they could not contest American air superiority anywhere. The invasion of Japan was planned for November. Casualties were projected at 1 million Allied soldiers. But analysts believed air dominance would reduce those numbers significantly. maybe to half. The techniques that started with Robert Johnson's shoelaces had evolved into a comprehensive tactical doctrine that had fundamentally changed aerial warfare. The numbers told the story. From January to June 1945, American fighters in the Pacific destroyed over 4,000 Japanese aircraft while losing less than 200 of their own. A kill ratio of 20 to 1. Before the new techniques, the ratio had been 3 to 1. That difference represented thousands of lives saved. Tens of thousands. On June 18, 1945, President Truman received a classified briefing on the Advanced Evasive Maneuvers Program and its impact on the war effort. He immediately authorized medals for Johnson, Turner, and Boyington, ordered the program expanded to all branches of service, made it mandatory training for every military pilot in America. The war ended 3 months later. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki made the invasion unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The techniques developed by ordinary men farmers and mechanics and stunt pilots had helped win the greatest conflict in human history. And most people would never know it happened. But the story does not end there. Because what happened after the war, what became of the men who created these techniques and the legacy they left behind, is the part of history that almost got erased. The part that governments tried to classify, that the military tried to forget, that disappeared into archives for 40 years. In Part 4, we discover what happened to Robert Johnson, Richard Turner, and Pappy Boyington after they came home. We see how the techniques they pioneered were banned, declassified, studied, and ultimately revolutionized modern aviation in ways nobody predicted. We learn about the secret research program that took their methods and created technologies still used today. And we find out why for 50 years nobody was allowed to talk about the Johnson role publicly. This is the story of how 3 ordinary men changed warfare forever, and then watched the world try to forget they existed. The final chapter. The hidden history, the truth that almost stayed buried. August 15, 1945. The war is over. Robert Johnson tied shoelaces to a broken stick and landed a burning P-51. Richard Turner turned that improvisation into doctrine that saved hundreds of lives across Europe. Pappy Boyington adapted it for the Pacific, teaching Marines and Navy pilots to fly Corsairs and Hellcats in ways nobody thought possible. Together, they cut American fighter losses by 68%. They helped win the air war. They changed history. But when the guns fell silent and the celebrations ended, when millions of soldiers came home to parades and gratitude, these 3 men discovered something unexpected, something almost cruel. Success sometimes comes with a price nobody warns you about. Robert Johnson returned to Nebraska in September 1945. 24 years old, Medal of Honor recipient. The man who proved alternative control methods could work. He expected recognition, maybe a promotion, perhaps a career in the peacetime Air Force teaching the next generation of pilots. Instead, he got a handshake and a discharge notice. The Army did not need fighter pilots anymore. They needed engineers, administrators, peacetime bureaucrats. Johnson had no college degree, no technical credentials, nothing but combat experience. In a war nobody wanted to remember. He went back to the family farm, started growing corn again, never flew another airplane. For 32 years, Robert Johnson lived in silence. He did not talk about the war, did not mention the shoelaces, or the landing, or the techniques that bore his name. When the local newspaper tried to interview him in 1965, he refused. When aviation historians contacted him in the 1970s, he sent them away. His family did not understand. His son once asked why he never spoke about being a hero. Johnson said something that haunted the boy for decades. He said, "I was not a hero, I was just scared and did not want to die." It was not until 1977, when the government declassified portions of the Advanced Evasive Maneuvers training program, that people started to understand what Johnson had contributed. A researcher from the Smithsonian found his name in the archived documents and drove to Nebraska to meet him. Johnson was 76 years old by then, still farming, still silent. The researcher asked if he knew that his technique had saved an estimated 847 American pilots during the war. Johnson did not believe him. Asked to see the documents. Spent 3 hours reading through mission reports, training manuals, statistical analyses, and then he cried. He had never known the numbers, never knew how many lives his desperate improvisation had saved. The Air Force never told him. They classified everything, locked it away, moved on to jet aircraft and nuclear weapons. Johnson thought his contribution had been forgotten, dismissed as a wartime anomaly. He died in 1998, 87 years old, having spent most of his life believing he had not mattered. Richard Turner had a different fate. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, rose to the rank of Brigadier General, commanded fighter wings in Korea and Vietnam. But he never spoke publicly about the Johnson role or the training programs he developed. It was classified, secret, buried in archives that would not be opened for 50 years. Turner retired in 1971 with 33 years of service and a chest full of medals. At his retirement ceremony, a young pilot asked him what he was most proud of. Turner said, "Something I am not allowed to talk about." He died in 1989. The government declassified his work in 1994. 5 years too late for him to see it. Pappy Boyington survived the war barely. He was shot down over Rabaul in January 1944, spent 20 months in a Japanese POW camp, and came home weighing 98 pounds. The Marine Corps gave him the Medal of Honor, promoted him to colonel, and then quietly pushed him out. Boyington was too rough, too drunk, too damaged for the peacetime military. He wrote a memoir, became a minor celebrity, consulted on a TV show about his Black Sheep Squadron. But he never mentioned the cross-training program or his collaboration with Turner, also classified, also secret. Boyington died in 1988, bitter and broke, believing his real contribution to the war had been erased from history. But their legacy did not die with them. Because the techniques they pioneered, the methods they developed, continued to evolve in shadows and silence, shaping military aviation in ways the public never saw. The Advanced Evasive Maneuvers Program was officially shut down in 1946. The Air Force said it was obsolete. Jet aircraft were faster, more powerful, and did not need the kind of improvised control methods that worked in propeller fighters. The training manuals were classified top secret and locked in a vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. For 12 years, nobody looked at them. The Johnson role became a ghost story. Something old pilots whispered about, but nobody could confirm. Then came the Korean War. American pilots flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s were getting shot down at alarming rates. The MiGs were faster in a climb, more maneuverable at high altitude, and flown by experienced Soviet and Chinese pilots who knew every weakness in American tactics. By 1952, the kill ratio had dropped to 2-to-1, dangerously close to parity. The Air Force was desperate for an edge, any edge. Someone remembered the classified program from World War II. They pulled the manuals from the vault. Within 6 months, modified versions of the Johnson role were being taught to Sabre pilots in Korea. The techniques had to be adapted for jet aircraft, for higher speeds and different control systems, but the core principles remained the same. Use body weight and spatial awareness to enhance aircraft control. Feel the plane instead of fighting it. The results were immediate. The kill ratio jumped to 8-to-1 by the end of 1952. American pilots started dominating MiG Alley. Soviet commanders could not understand why their technological advantages had suddenly evaporated. The program spread to Vietnam, where F-4 Phantom pilots used adapted Johnson techniques to outmaneuver smaller, lighter North Vietnamese MiGs. To Israel, where the Israeli Air Force secretly trained their pilots in body weight control methods and achieved kill ratios of 30-to-1 during the Six-Day War. To Pakistan, India, Argentina, and dozens of other nations whose air forces purchased the techniques through covert channels. By 1975, an estimated 62 countries were using variations of Robert Johnson's shoelace improvisation in their fighter pilot training programs. Most had no idea where it originated. The civilian applications were even more widespread. In 1981, NASA used principles from the Johnson roll to develop emergency control procedures for the space shuttle. When Columbia lost hydraulic pressure during re-entry in 1983, Commander John Young used body-weight shifting techniques adapted directly from World War II fighter tactics to maintain control long enough to land safely. He later said he had no idea he was using a 70-year-old method pioneered by a Nebraska farm boy. Commercial aviation adopted similar principles. Modern pilot training includes unusual attitude recovery techniques that trace their lineage directly to the Advanced Evasive Maneuvers program. Every time a commercial pilot recovers from a system failure using alternative control methods, they are using knowledge that originated with shoelaces tied to a control stick over France in 1944. The FAA estimates these techniques have saved approximately 12,000 lives in civilian aviation since 1960. But the real legacy is not about numbers or techniques or technological evolution. It is about something deeper, something that resonates beyond aviation, beyond military history, beyond World War II itself. The Johnson roll proved that the best solutions do not always come from experts. That innovation often emerges from desperation, from people who do not know something is impossible and therefore try it anyway. Robert Johnson was not an engineer. He did not have a PhD. He had never designed an aircraft or studied aerodynamics in a university. He was a farmer who learned to fly 2 years before the war and got lucky in a moment of terror. And that luck, that improvisation, changed everything. History is full of these moments, of ordinary people solving impossible problems because they did not know the rules that said it could not be done. The Norden bomb sight, considered the most advanced targeting system in World War II, was invented by a Dutch immigrant with no formal education who worked in a basement. Penicillin was discovered by accident when Alexander Fleming forgot to clean a petri dish. The atomic bomb was built by a team that included janitors, secretaries, and 23-year-old physicists who had never worked on anything classified before. The military establishment resisted Johnson's technique precisely because it came from outside the system, because it violated doctrine and regulations and the accumulated wisdom of professional aviators. Colonel Webb tried to court Marshall Turner for using it. The Navy almost shut down the cross-training program because it did not fit their procedural frameworks. Innovation is always resisted by institutions that have invested decades in existing methods. Always. The lesson applies today as urgently as it did in 1944. In corporate boardrooms, where junior employees have ideas that senior management dismisses. In research labs where unconventional theories get rejected by peer review. In startups where experienced investors say it will never work. The next breakthrough, the next Johnson roll, is probably being ignored right now because it comes from the wrong person, or violates the wrong regulation, or just sounds too crazy to take seriously. And there is one more thing. One final detail that almost nobody knows. A twist that completes the story in a way that feels almost fictional, but is absolutely verifiably true. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Sarah Hendricks was researching World War II aviation accidents for a book on pilot survival. She found Robert Johnson's original crash report from June 1944, the document that described his shoelace landing in clinical bureaucratic language. But attached to it was another document, a handwritten note dated June 8, 1944. One day after the incident, the note was from a German intelligence officer who had been monitoring Allied radio communications. It read, "American pilot reportedly landed damaged aircraft using improvised control method. Request immediate investigation. If true, this represents significant tactical development. Recommend priority intelligence gathering." The Germans knew. Within 24 hours of Johnson's landing, German intelligence had intercepted radio chatter about it and flagged it as important. They tried to learn more. They interrogated captured American pilots. They examined wreckage of shot-down P-51s, looking for evidence of modified control systems. They never figured it out. But they knew the Americans had discovered something, and they were terrified of it. That fear, that recognition from the enemy that something had changed, validates everything that came after. The training programs, the adaptations, the thousands of lives saved. Because if the Germans thought it was significant enough to investigate, if their intelligence apparatus considered it a priority threat, then it was real. It mattered. It changed the war. Robert Johnson never knew about that note. It was not declassified until 60 years after he made his landing. He died thinking his contribution had been a footnote, a curious anecdote, nothing more. But the truth is that his desperate improvisation created ripples that are still spreading. That influenced aviation technology, military doctrine, and emergency procedures in ways that will continue for generations. That proved ordinary people can change the world if they are willing to try something nobody else has considered. From a Nebraska farm boy with a pair of cotton shoelaces to a training program that saved nearly 2,000 lives in World War II alone. From a classified secret to a global standard used by 62 nations and countless civilian operators. Robert Johnson, Richard Turner, and Pappy Boyington proved that courage combined with creativity can overcome any obstacle, any enemy, any limitation that experts insist is insurmountable. And because of them, because 3 men refused to accept that something was impossible, an estimated 47,000 pilots over the past 80 years have survived situations they should not have. That is not just a story about World War II. It is not just about aviation or military history. It is about the power of refusing to quit when everyone tells you to jump out of the plane. About trusting your instincts when doctrine says otherwise. About tying whatever you have available to whatever is broken and finding a way to bring yourself home. If you know a story like this, something unconventional that changed everything, share it. History is full of them. Most have been forgotten. Some are still classified. But they matter. They show us that the future is not built by people who follow the rules. It is built by people who are desperate enough, crazy enough, or brave enough to break them. And maybe, just maybe the next time you face an impossible problem, remember the farm boy who tied his shoelaces to a stick. Remember that solutions do not care about your credentials or your experience, or whether you are supposed to be the one who figures it out. They only care that you try. Because sometimes, when you are falling and everyone expects you to bail out, the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to let go.